Spread the fire, fam. Welcome back to SMWX, and today I'm really excited to bring you a two-part interview with Lebohang Pheko, one of South Africa's most exciting and incisive public intellectuals, from economics to history to current affairs. She's really one of the best minds that we have analyzing social problems. So whether you're watching part 1 or part 2, make sure you check the other parts and like, share, subscribe. Thank you for taking us to beyond 20,000 subscribers. Let's get into it. Ayeye. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX, and today I'm extremely excited to bring you another conversation with one of South Africa's premier public intellectuals, someone who thinks across the humanities and economics and history, and is here to bring her considerable insights to you, the viewers of this channel. It's Lebohang Pheko. We're so very glad to have you on SMWX. Pheko, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Suso. Appreciate it.
You've been requested many times on social media, so I feel like I'm finally delivering for our viewers today as a guest.
Glad we could help. Thank you.
Pleasure. And there's a lot going on, as usual, in our wonderful and frustrating country. And I wanted to start on this question of the student protests as a window into perhaps a deeper crisis that exists in South Africa today. To what extent do you think that these student protests are an isolated event, or maybe symptomatic of a broader problem of historical inequality?
Yeah, great question, and difficult to respond to fully without becoming quite historical, if I may. So I think
feel free, by the way. There are no time limits.
Thank you. So I think the first is drawing back to social inclusion, education inclusion, and who is and isn't entitled. It's a basic matrix of entitlements, capabilities that we have used in this country since 1994, and I'll go back further in a second. And unfortunately, it feeds into the notion that education is not a public good, but that education is something, it's a privilege. It's something that is only, a few people are entitled to, and we see this in the fee structure. And I think the policing of Black knowledge, the policing of young people, and of course, the policing of Black poverty and poverty shaming, without an understanding and an appreciation that the majority of African people in this country have not been able to build the sort of intergenerational capital to access to access universities, to even access so-called good schools, which is a whole other conversation. And that the context of this, of course, is quite deliberate and structural, as you rightly say. So it's really linked to the notion that African people's role and African people's minds were only for the service of white capital primarily, and that was only very limited to a few professions, and that was really linked to a kind of a social engineering, an apartheid-related colonial social engineering, in common with many other settler colonies, by the way. The Portuguese did it, as we know. The French did it, as we know, where a few people were able to assimilate and to be promoted into quasi-whiteness or adjacent whiteness, but that the majority were really to know their place as workers, as maids, as minors, and so forth. And that this was actually then structurally, the structural inhibitions also included the geography of where institutions of higher learning were. So the only university that we had, not only for South Africa, but for the region at some stage, was the University of Fort Hare, which holds a particular and very special place. So our presence in other institutions is still seen as an encumbrance, as invasive, and as deeply, deeply unsettling to the imagination of whiteness. And as we know, whiteness as an imagination, imperialism as an imagination, doesn't actually require the presence of white people to thrive, right? It can thrive all on its own. It kind of runs on remote control. So the people at Rhodes, black people at Wits, black people at Stellies, and so on, still seen as interlopers. And this is why, we had our universities. And I think the only parallel that I can think of is, historically black universities in the US and our so-called Bush universities, right? And your TURF and Vista, whatever used to be called Vista, and even the geography of those universities. I go now even to some of the now rationalized forms of those universities, because I like to invest a lot of time in those spaces. I mean, they look like glorified high schools. The libraries are shocking. The lighting is dodgy. The books are, I've got more books in my little cupboard here than a whole university library, Sizwe. So there's a psychological exclusion, there's a historic exclusion, there's a financial exclusion, and of course there's an ideological exclusion. Before then we even get to the notion of the economics of going to universities, who does and doesn't belong, who can and cannot go, and that this is linked, of course, with the neoliberal market-led idea that of class bias, right? Of class engineering, and that it's trying to build a new form and trying to consolidate the class project, the middle class and the elite class project, by enabling a few clever darkies, a few clever blacks, the chosen few, to access these corridors of learning, as people used to say back in the day, and to ensure that others are left in an aspirational state of constant longing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so key to situate this, because I think we constantly see these conflagrations and fail to trace them back to even their immediate historical roots. So I think there's so much that I'd love to explore in what you say there, but the one thing that you bring me to reflect on is that post 94, it seems as though inclusion has become deracialized, and that has led people to assume that exclusion is also deracialized, but it's not. The same people are excluded: poor, black, women disproportionately. And so we've opened the doors of inclusion, or at least spaces of privilege. We've deracialized those spaces, but we haven't deracialized the spaces outside those spaces. And it kind of creates this ability for people who want to pursue a conservative agenda to say, but look, it's deracialized, when exclusion is still racialized, is still gendered, etc.
So, and the notion, of course, of what a liberatory agenda looks like. So that's the difference between having, I think, a democratic agenda and having a liberatory one. So democracy is easy, constitutions are easy, and we've got, if we could eat constitutions and this so-called best constitution in the world, we wouldn't even be having the constant social insurrections that we see in this country, right? If the Bill of Rights, in fact, did deliver on those rights in ways that are substantive, in a day-to-day way, if people did have enough to eat, if African people and Black bodies were valued with the sorts of housing, water, sanitation, and so forth, that is due to all of us as human beings, then we wouldn't be having these sorts of conversations. And it's almost as though, maybe let me be definitive and say it's not almost as though, it is the fact, it is situational, that a lot of the problem and a lot of the discomforts of universities, as you rightly say, stem from a disproportionate value of African lives and African bodies and Black bodies. And it also stems from this notion that, in fact, we are not entirely human, and that we are still, in fact, we need to earn our way into respectability and earn our way into compliance. And I think that there's a very compliant state bullying that has been taking place, trying to keep people muzzled slightly, just enough to stop from, prevent complete insurrection, which I think is bubbling under the surface quite quite tangibly, quite visibly, and has been for a really long time, but not enough to really deal with the structural issues that need to take place. So fees must fall, I think, has become a metaphor for the many structural deficiencies and deficits of not only intergenerational and interhistorical moments before 1994, but also the ones that lead to the kind of very vapid and slightly aloof form of governance that this state has towards its citizens and its people. And I say that as pejoratively as it conveys, because this notion of our people is very much this. It also is linked to the notion of the state being some kind of a Father Christmas, Easter Bunny, and almost doing these things as a favor. So why do you have to call a press conference when you've built a house? You're supposed to. Why do you call a press conference because the 1,000th tap in a particular township has been erected and there's Ugogosoko there to switch on a tap? I mean, this whole notion of not only infantilizing Black people in this country, but it's also the notion of the state behaving almost as though it's a generous benefactor, a feudal relationship, rather than an instrument, a transaction of power and responsibility between the state and people. So as a result of all of that, and I think as a result of all of this Father Christmasing of public policy and state resources and state funds, it also there's this dissonance, and I think there's a disdain, I think, from the state towards people. And that's kind of a historical disdain. And I think it comes from the people who were originally part of liberation movements, not only in South Africa, but across the continent, right? So typically mission-led, or in the case of West Africa, deeply Quranic, deeply, leadership of different religious orders, but deeply anglicized and deeply linked to mission and Christianized education, often taken away from the context of the people, right? So often educated across out of the continent. For example, the first 6 presidents of the French belt, that's Guinea, Mali, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, and there's another one that I'm forgetting. But all of them went to the same school, the same quite elite school on the island of Gorée. That to me cannot be coincidental, kind of like their version of a Model C school, right? Very French, very, wow. Promoting this idea of being a French citizen abroad, right? And then all of them, of course, go off to the Sorbonne or wherever in Paris and so forth. And that cannot be a coincidence. President Nyerere went off to Scotland. Of course, President Nkrumah went off to the States, and so on and so forth. The good news of that, of course, is that there is this kind of Pan-African interlinkages that take place between an Nkrumah and a Du Bois. But I do think that strange dislocation that nearly all of our liberation leaders on this the men, to be specific, most of the men and a lot of the women, the elitism was seen as leadership was seen as the purview of leadership, which is why even speaking English was seen, or French in the case of French West Africa, was seen as a sign of leadership. I mean, how do I go to a Sotho community, for example, and yet I have a translator? What am I conveying other than that I feel that I am better than the people around me? So it's this kind of disdainful top-down distance and dissonance between leadership and Black people in this country, which I think is kind of almost proves what I was saying earlier on, that you don't need white supremacist colonialism in physical form for their bidding and for their agenda and for their imagination to continue.
When so much of what you say makes me think of the bankruptcy of, well, 2 things actually. The one is our vision of I don't know if it would be called rehabilitation or just all-out punishment, which is what it really is in South Africa. And I think we've not thought enough about how we have reproduced patterns of colonial and apartheid punishment in the present. And when I look at Mthokozisi Ntumba, only the most recent of many thousands of people by now killed by the police, it does seem as though the ANC government in some ways has fallen into this trap of failing to reimagine what a state in this context should be, and just using its force to suppress lethally, if necessary, any form of challenge to its legitimacy. And it feels like, it's almost become farcical how often this is now happening.
And in fact, I mean, there's statistics upon statistics about how South African police have actually killed more people per capita than anywhere in the world. I know that the colleagues in the US dispute that. I mean, I know that there are different indices that we can use, but we have one of the most violent police forces in the world. I mean, I personally have literally a visceral reaction when I see the cops. It's like, oh Lord, I'm driving along, listening to my music, listening to my jazz. It's like, okay, what do you want now? What now, basically? And it's not a good feeling. And I think that there's also a sense in which, again, it illustrates a couple of things that, as you very rightly say, Sizwe, that the state hasn't managed to imagine itself away from the colonial construct of violence against Black bodies. That's the one thing. And I think that's why sometimes guys in the diaspora find it hard to conceive of how a Black government, an African-led government, at least on the surface of it, can as well, meet such violence against other Black bodies. Like, how can the Marikana happen post-1994? How can Andreas Tatane happen post-1994? And the many others, the litany of many others, and the ones who are not only shot, who are not only killed by open fire, but by silent neglect as well, by structural and systematic neglect, whether it's in hospitals, and so on and so forth. And the thing as well, the odd thing about this is that it keeps happening, but I think the thing that worries me is that we become inured to it. I feel as though there's almost this sighing resignation to it of, okay, this is how it is. And that, yes, we'll get cheesed off, we'll get up on Twitter, and then occasionally, as we're seeing the last couple of weeks across the country with young people who are saying that, we can't do this nonsense, not now, really. We've had a difficult year, our parents have lost their jobs, those who even have access to funding in the first place, access to work in the first place. In the meantime, 5 billion rand was taken off of the state fiscus from NASFAS. I mean, yeah, who does that? Like, who does that? Who removes funding right now? And then, what do we expect? What do institutions expect? A bunch of flowers from young people, standing ovation? I mean, what do you want from people, right? And how often can you be brutalized cognitively, brutalized financially, brutalized psychosocially? And remember that, of course, for a lot of young people and for whole communities, this one child is a ticket out for a whole household, if not a whole community. So if they're not in school, it means that social insurance and that social welfareism that they're hoping will emerge if this young person comes out of university. And I mean, the rate of exclusion makes it a big if they get a job within a year of graduation, and again, the rate of unemployed graduates makes that another big if, and if their degree or their qualification is still even useful by the time they've received the job. And I mean, it breaks my heart every single year where young people come out bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and they get that tassel and, you tap them on their head. And it's like, and that maybe 1 out of 2 of them are not even within a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. I mean, I get people who I taught 10 years ago who have never, ever worked this way. It breaks my heart.
Sure, that's so. Just what you say also about the many millions actually who have suffered under silent neglect and structural neglect, in addition to the violence, is something we don't think about. And of course, also takes us back to a painful history of millions again suffering, maybe in silence, being confined to these open air spaces for black people, and that for me is just the most difficult thing to reckon with when I meditate on apartheid as an idea, is just the sheer scale of the social control. I understand that many tens of thousands were directly murdered, but just the millions, and still today we have the system and situation where millions are still confined and are still effectively unable to emerge. And the solution, I'm starting to wonder, is quite, and this is the second bankruptcy actually, is the solution is this ideology of non-racialism, which I'm very confused about. I just think maybe it may have had a noble moment, back in the 1980s or something. Even that is probably in dispute. But it seems to me this idea of non-racialism has now been co-opted by, quite frankly, the DA, the Institute of Race Relations, people who want to use the N-word and then pretend that they are entitled to do so because of non-racialism. And a conception of racial justice has been lost, it seems to me, in this whole notion of non-racialism.